Good morning to everyone. Welcome to this second day of our Transmedia Literacy International Conference. And welcome to our second dialogue. Today we have two key referents in the world of media literacy and research on teenagers, media, and education. I'm going to introduce, the dynamics is the same as yesterday. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Then we will have these two short presentations. Then we have the discussion, dialogue. And remember that you can write your questions. And in the second part of the presentation, we can introduce this question to our keynotes. So thanks, Sonia and Heather, for coming and joining our conversation. Sonia Livingstone, I have to read this. You already know her, but it's part of the protocol. Sonia Livingstone is professor of social psychology and the doctoral program director in the Department of Media and Communication in the London School of Economics and Political Science. About her research, you already know that, but it's about taking a comparative, critical, and contextual approach. Her research examines how the changing conditions of mediation are reshaping everyday practices and possibilities for action. She published more than 20 books on media audiences, media literacy, media regulation. Today, I think she's going to talk about one of her last books and researches. This book was published with Julian Sefton Green. It's called The Class. So we are going to also to talk about this research and this book. Sonia has advised the UK government, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and other national and international organizations on children's rights, risk, and safety in the digital age. She was awarded with the title of Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2014 for services to children and child internet safety. Sonia is a fellow of many academic societies, and she's fellow and past president of the International Communication Association, the ICA. She has received many awards and honors, including honorary doctorates from the University of Montreal, from Erasmus University of Rotterdam, Basque Country, and University of Copenhagen. She's right now leading the project Global Kids Online with UNICEF Office and Research Innocenti and European Union Kids Online, EU Kids Online. She's researching children's understanding of digital privacy and working different projects in this area. She participates in the European Commission funded research networks, Digiliter and Makey. She runs a blog called parenting.digital, and I think the most important thing for her is that she will be on sabbatical on spring 2018. Sorry for us. So if you have any questions, today is the day because you will be on sabbatical. You should explain how to do that. Okay, thanks Heather for joining us. She's professor in the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Sydney. Before, when she joined the Transmedia Literacy Project, she was in RMIT University in Melbourne. She's a sociocultural anthropologist. Her research focuses on understanding how digital media, technology, and other forms of material culture mediate relationships, communication, learning, mobility, and our sense of being human. Her books examining these arguments include The Cell Phone, An Anthropology of Communication, Kids Living and Learning with Digital Media, Findings from the Digital Youth Project. I have one copy of this very well-known book. I think everyone here has been reading also this book and introducing in the references for our papers and articles. Another classic, Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out. She participated in this huge research, and she's going to talk about this today. Digital anthropology, digital ethnography. Her current research explores transformations in the telecommunication industry and the emergence of new mobile media practices across the Asia-Pacific region. So, I think one more page here, sorry. She's member of many academic societies, and is participating in different projects, including the Transmedia Literacy Research. So, welcome to our second dialogue. As I told you before, the protocol is like yesterday. Sonia will start, and we are going to sit in the first row, and we are going to start with the first presentation. Thanks, and please, Sonia.
So, Carlos, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's good to see so many people here interested in questions of media literacy, transmedia literacy. So in my short remarks to kick off this conversation, I'm going to talk about the book which I wrote with Julian Sefton Green. And it's, if you like, an ethnographic approach to the lives of young teenagers in the digital age. And I've been thinking since Carlos invited me here today, what do we say in the book about media literacy? Or transmedia literacies, and how can I, and I was asked to kind of think methodologically a little about how to research questions of media literacy. The book is, Julian and I spent a year or a little more with one class of 28, 13-year-olds. They were turning 13 to 14 that year. And we were trying to understand the entirety of their lives in the digital age, but media literacy was certainly a strand of that. So the project is part of, in fact, the same research enterprise that was just introduced in terms of Heather, led by Mimi Ito. The research was part of the Connected Learning Network funded by the Macarthur Foundation, which has now been kind of reformed as the Connected Learning Alliance. And essentially the premise is that certain modes of sociality in the digital age that really support forms of connection can enhance the kinds of learning with and through digital media that we might see as, or we could see as creative, as sustainable, as critical, and as offering forms of engagement. So that project is kind of, as I said, moving into new forms, but taking with it the idea that one is trying to see what is interest-led by young people, what are their interests in learning with digital media, where do they find their peer support in their opportunities to learn, how can social and digital networks underpin and support that process of learning. And the kind of big picture is to offer a socio-cultural approach which counters the individualism of many schools and indeed government assumptions about pedagogy. So this is my kind of sketch of our ethnographic methodology, just to kind of ground you in the setting. We thought of the young people's lives, these 28, 13-year-olds, as engaging with digital media in school through processes of learning. They're also social engagement, in the home and around their family, and with their peer group, and in their rather local lives, which define the kind of the small worlds of 13-year-olds. And the digital I've drawn as a kind of a cloud that underpins and intersects and comes in and out of those different spaces. And then our research was phased, so each phase was round about 3 or 4 months, and we began in the school, we moved into the home, we then did our best to engage with the young people in their peer group and online. And for this presentation, I guess I might ask the questions: where is media literacy learned? What kinds of learning does that involve? Who supports media literacy learning? And how is it sustained and developed over time? And as fitted the connected learning model, we were especially interested in the connections and disconnections across those different sites of learning. So I suggest it was a strength of the project that we could look at the same young people as they were in school, as they went home, as they were with their peers and online. And so just some kind of snapshots really of the very kind of ordinary settings in which our research was connected. So I think what was perhaps crucial for thinking where is media literacy learned we were in the lives of the young people at school and at home and online. Of course, they were in all of those sites as well, and the digital media connected those sites, but the adults didn't cross the boundaries. So the parents had a very at a distance relationship with the school, and the school really struggled to have an understanding of what was happening in the homes or indeed young people's lives online. So the adults who were trying to support or guide or direct the young people's learning were disconnected, but the young people and the digital media offered the connections. So I've already completely lost track of time. Heather, you're going to... Okay. Okay. One kind of way of coming in was, of course, that the young people were all using all kinds of digital media. They had all kinds of devices, especially their phones. They all used the internet for homework and for communication and so on. One strand in the book was to try to understand where creative engagements with digital media took place. And at that point, the class of 28 really kind of narrowed down. So perhaps the most they participated in was making their own kind of online playlists. That might be a sort of a minimal definition of creativity. About half had edited photographs and videos, though half had not even done that. And around half had created some kind of content, whether it was a blog or a podcast or music or videos or art or whatever. But what was striking watching them over the year is that a number would come, kind of engage with a creative digital media activity for a while, and then it would fade. And they were, as it were, coming in and out of these practices at different times during the year, experimenting in some ways, and very often hitting a kind of a wall where they would not find the support or the encouragement from their family, peers, teachers, or indeed the satisfaction from themselves. So it was already a kind of a struggle and a question that I would ask more widely. How is it that the kinds of learning that young people do want to experiment with and do enjoy experimenting with, how can that be sustained over time? And the book had ended up with lots of stories of what we thought of as missed opportunities, moments when we could see, for example, Joel, a rather kind of shy boy on the edge of the social scene, who got very enthusiastic at one point in the year about using YouTube tutorials linked to music-making software, and he talked about this among his friends, and he talked about it with us. But when we pursued it, we realized it was more of a promise, and he hadn't actually done it, and by the end of the year, the equipment and the software was kind of left on the side. So there was the aspiration, very often not followed through. And this was in a school, and I'll come back to this at the end, where digital media were very prominent, but very heavily used in instrumental ways to track the learning and the learning analytics, and to kind of measure and instrumentalize the young people's learning. So some of the creative, spontaneous activities that they generated at home or with their friends would kind of hit this very different way of using digital media in school. Oops, sorry. So one of our kind of most creative kids was Giselle, who engaged with, at one point, with stop frame animation, which is what I've shown here. And this led me to think about the power of genre. In the kind of world of digital media creativity, a number of them would experiment with, as it were, amenable, small, established genres of engagement. So stop frame animation is one. We had one kid who created finger skateboard videos. I'm kind of tempted to show all of these things. There were various other kind of genres that were played with, and we could see the genres as scaffolding the young person's role It offers a set of discrete skills. It's kind of fairly easy to finish and do and upload. You become part of that much larger community of people who are making stop frame animation or finger skateboard videos. You gain a kind of identity and a set of relations with others. So a very small genre, not, we could debate how creative it is, but it allows all the kind of social infrastructure that scaffolds the engagement of a 13-year-old and clearly scaffolds the things that are important to them, which is about identity and distinctiveness, but also social relations. So Giselle, who made this and a number of other things, was one of the kids who managed to sustain her forms of experimentation over the year, and most, as I said, started and stopped. And what was important was that when we saw her in other sites, she had many social spaces that were working with her. So this was a middle-class girl from an artistic home where her parents were very committed to using digital artistic media to support both her learning and her kind of digital media literacies, and to do so in a way that was explicitly counter the instrumental pedagogy of the school. So they had a very kind of strong, resistant, kind of bohemian ethos that they were trying to support. So her activity was one of many. Her family had its own Minecraft server. She'd built her own computer. I could tell you many things that worked together to support her engagement over the year. Though, a couple of years later, when I went back to see her and she was on the point of heading off to university, she was still an artist. That identity had absolutely sustained, but she'd given up on all the technology and she'd gone back to watercolour. So she'd learned something, but it may not be digital media. And I could tell you, one kind of contrasting case, perhaps, Adam, who was a very keen gamer, who didn't make his own media, but he played the games, watched the YouTube walkthroughs for the games, and found within his gaming space a sphere of confidence and competence, which we didn't see anywhere else. And we watched this young 13-year-old boy sullen at school with teachers who were disappointed in him, anxious parents trying to practice concerted cultivation and to push him at everything that might work, and none of it worked. A boy who was kind of, had a history of feeling angry, school refusal, anxiety, and in this game, which he played with strangers, worrying his parents horribly, he felt at home and competent, finally. And those sustained their practices over the year, but most kind of stopped and started. So I remember early in the field work, I met this girl, Sarah, who had made these beautiful Play-Doh food images, and she'd uploaded them to her social media, and her friends were all liking it, and it seemed like this is connected learning. She's being creative. It's supported by her, admired by her family, supported by her peers. Where might it go? It went nowhere. It was like, it made a beautiful PowerPoint slide, and a few weeks later she had stopped. And at the same time as she began this, her parents bought her a telescope for Christmas, and astronomy became her kind of real passion. Maybe there's a digital dimension to that. I don't know. Abby, a young girl from a very poor home who loved music. And in London, you might think that there are many opportunities for learning music and playing and making her own and creating and uploading, but the stakes are also very high in a city, and she couldn't kind of make it into that extraordinarily competitive world of music production. So she had set her sights on the best school to learn music in London, and of course she didn't get in. And ended up, I'm sure very successfully, but going into another field that involved no digital media learning. With another friend, Salma, she had also spent a day that got us interested, setting up her own YouTube channel, posting 8 or 10 episodes of the Abby and Salma show, getting likes and comments from others. And then one day the history teacher got wind of this and made fun of it in class, and that was it. Abby and Salma didn't go near digital media for, not in a creative, public sense, for quite a while. One last story from the fieldwork. This is from Megan, who was a girl who was incredibly kind of public and successful in her peer group, and she was the kind of the cool girl who, who kind of was engaged with many things. And it took quite a while. It took maybe 8 months into the fieldwork before we discovered that she also had an incredibly private use of one social medium where she most felt that she was learning, gaining control over the complexities of a particular social media platform and most expressing herself. And she would not show anybody her Tumblr, not her friends, not her family, not us, but she talked about it with such a passion as the one kind of creative place where she could really... and this was, so as I say, a very outgoing girl. Took a long time before she even mentioned this. So just a kind of quick commentary on the school, because there were we kind of meeting these kids and getting to know their individual stories, but every day, we didn't go every day, several times a week when we went, we also saw them in school, and we were watching the ways in which media are used by the teachers within school. And this is 3 quick stories here from the media that teachers choose to introduce in the school. The first thing you might observe is that this, very often what the teachers introduced was the media of their youth, not those of the young people's youth. So I love watching an exercise in music technology where the kids were trying to play the Chariots of Fire theme tune in a large room with lots and lots of technology. And of course, they all had their music on their phones. They all had their interests. But no, they were asked, please, to play the theme tune from this very out-of-date film, which the teacher clearly loved and they didn't know. They recognised it once they heard it, but that's not the point. It's an example of the kind of disconnection where nobody in that class said, what music do you like? What music do you listen to at home? What music are you trying to create? It was, here is our set piece. It was even, the disconnect between home and school was even more obvious in a history lesson where the teacher was using roots as an example, and we saw a similar thing with Blood Diamond in geography, where they were using these kind of big Hollywood blockbusters as a way of making the boring subject interesting, whether it was the history of slavery or the geography of the slave trade. There were lots of commonalities. What was 2 points about media literacy learning in relation to those examples. One is that this was a class of mixed children, black, white, brown faces, different countries that they come from, different histories. No mention of this in the teaching of the history of slavery. No engagement with the difference of the children and where they come from in their homes. And secondly, and I think really importantly, in the media literacy class, whatever, let's say, 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, the children were encouraged to be critical, engaged, creative learners. But in all the other classes where the media were introduced to liven up a Friday afternoon or liven up a geography or a history lesson, the media are, again, the window on the world. And again, here they are, this is how you look through, and nobody said who made it, what kind of a world does this represent, what kind of techniques does it use to construct particular visions. So, okay, I think I'm going to stop there. It must have struck you that in my class, which was very mixed in terms of poor, middle and wealthier backgrounds, the creative instances especially those which were sustained, came more from the middle-class children, and that echoes with survey research that the digital media creativity is in many ways an act of privilege, especially if we're looking for that which is interest-led, that which comes from the child, because it's so significantly supported by the home. And not only was that a kind of privilege, but it took that level of privilege to counter the dominant instrumental ethos of the school. So those poorer kids who, of course, were interested in learning through media and engaging with media, did not kind of manage to find a way to overcome the wall of instrumental kind of metricized learning in the school, whereas the middle class ones who gained, that sense of entitlement that Annette Leroux has written about, had the way to make sometimes connections, or sometimes at least to sustain the different worlds simultaneously. So thank you very much. I should stop there.
Thank you, Sonia, for this beautiful presentation. And now, Heather will continue this presentation about methodologies for analyzing media literacy. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so first of all, Sonia's a hard act to follow. It's great, but it's always wonderful to kind of get lost in whatever Sonia's latest project is. So thank you for letting me do that. And it's funny because I think where Sonia really, kind of highlighted, the latest research, and really engaged with this sort of media literacies part of this sort of question. Mine is actually going to be much more about, because I'm going to be talking about two projects, now quite old and dated, but still interesting project, the Digital Youth one, and then another one that I've been doing with colleagues in Melbourne, Australia, Larissa Horst, Sarah Pink, and a range of others. And so I'll talk about those two projects, and I'm going to really kind of I'll talk much less about the actual research and talk a bit more about the methods and really the kind of how we actually come to understand and know and learn about media literacies, particularly when you are sort of inclined toward ethnography and anthropology, as I am, and well, you're not anthropology, but ethnography, certainly. So, yeah, you didn't want to claim that. So anyway, so just to sort of, as I was saying, I think the one thing to kind of understand about any of the research that I'll be talking about, and including the Digital Youth Project, which was actually really formed by Mimi Ito, who was a cultural anthropologist. It was shaped by kind of ethnographic methods that come from anthropology. That sort of both the measure in terms of how we conduct ethnography, but also how we modify, adapt, to kind of subvert traditional ethnographic techniques has been quite important, particularly as we study digital media and technology. And I think the only thing here, you can sort of read the slides, but I think the important thing for no matter how much we kind of alter our methodologies to deal with various constraints, which I'll talk about, the kind of the gold prize is really to try to understand the world from the vantage point and of the people that you're studying, and in an empathetic way to really try to do that. So whether we're studying youth, whether we're studying parents, whether we're studying teachers, etc., that's the kind of goal. And so the methods and things like that are very much about kind of attaining that goal rather than methods per se, or rather than arguing long-term, short-term, traditional ethnographic methods are better or worse for particular things. So I think that's sort of important. And as I'm sort of putting here, the key methodological challenge in all of these projects is in how do you gain access to people in their media worlds in meaningful and ethical ways. And that second point I'll talk about in more depth. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'll talk a bit about the Digital Youth Project and kind of more about the research design and why things look the way they did, and maybe not, I think it sounds like everyone is familiar at least with the book. And then this other project called Locating the Mobile, which is funded by the Australian Research Council. It's the lead investigator is Larissa Horst, but we also have investigators from Shanghai and Tokyo, and we've had a series of researchers in Melbourne, including my colleague Jelena Sininen, who has been quite involved in this work. So I think, as we said, we know the book, The Digital Youth Project. This was sort of the outcome of it. Our basic question when we started this research was really how are digital media changing the way in which people, particularly young people, communicate, socialize, and play. It was a very broad-based study. It wasn't really about defining literacies per se, although we were in conversation with people like Henry Jenkins, with learning scientists and others, but it was really much more a project that was about what was going on, and the things that eventually formed the Connected Learning Research Network. Those were kind of hypotheses that then sort of evolved and have then taken new forms and shapes over the past, was it 7 years, 10 years? I don't want to think about that. I think the thing that's quite important, and it doesn't necessarily come across in the book unless you are really reading it quite closely, is that this actually was a series of quite federated projects. So I think actually I'll go to the next slide first. And then, so I mean, the entire project, it was 22 case studies, 28 researchers, almost 600 interviews, focus groups, diary studies, questionnaires, a range of sort of research methods, but carried out by 28 researchers who ranged from master's students at UC Berkeley to postdocs and more sort of senior researchers. So what it meant, and I think this is one of the differences, you'll hear more about the Transmedia Literacies project later, but one of the things that it meant is that no one was doing the same project. We all had very clusters of kind of different kind of domains that we were working in. Sometimes we crossed across. So of course, my main focus was looking at families in Silicon Valley. And there were a cluster of people who worked in kind of household and family sites. And we worked together and talked together. And sometimes we even went to each other's sites. But what we were doing was quite different than what was happening in people who were studying network sites. So for example, Patricia Lang was studying YouTube at the moment. I think we all know who was studying MySpace. And so, obviously we would be, in homes and families, interviews with kids and families, these sites would come in, we would be in dialogue, but they were quite separate and distinct studies. And sometimes, with such a large team, you didn't even know all of the sort of things that were kind of going on. The institutional spaces were also quite important and distinct, I think particularly to a US context where after-school programs really kind of dominate sort of things. So I think what's important to sort of recognize here, I think from a kind of project design sort of thing, is that this wasn't we were trying to kind of cast a wide net and to really answer the question of what was sort of going on. So it meant that, we didn't have like for like, we didn't have questionnaires. We had people, we had kids who were 8 years old and people who were 28, 30 years old participating in video blogging communities, et cetera. So it's a quite different kind of project and sets a quite different kind of agenda in terms of what is ethnographic about each sort of site. And this was also really a moment where we were trying to kind of define what that is. So I think one of the things, so with each of these projects, I just want to kind of highlight some of the key challenges in the way from, I think, the perspective of a kind of ethnographic approach. I think one of the key challenges we had in the study was to actually move across domains. So I mean, one of the things I really like about, and I've talked to Julian about this, is how you actually designed ways to move across the classroom to the peer groups or whatever. But as you said, it's quite, the parents didn't move across that, so you had to kind of find other ways to kind of access those spaces. And it was quite difficult to kind of go from families to peer groups. So you would get the family, sibling, that dynamic, but to then move into their peer groups, it was challenging. It was very, very difficult to move from online communities to kind of place-based relationships, unless it was a kind of particular fan kind of community. And very difficult to, for lots of reasons, kind of move between the kind of teachers, parents, and all of those sort of things in this kind of context. So I think that was one of the things that we sort of got in this project. We got glimpses of those worlds, but we could never really move more than 3. So even like CJ Pascal was working with working class families in the San Francisco Bay Area, she would turn up, she had lots of access to the kids. She would meet with them, do interviews. She would go to meet the parents at the house, and the parents would slam the door in her face, want nothing to kind of do with her. And you know, the kids were, you know, getting the permission forms and bringing them, but CJ wasn't interacting, which was the exact opposite way that I was engaging with parents in Silicon Valley. I think a second sort of challenge with this project, and you know, we worked around in different ways, was sort of the challenge I think we always have of adults studying youth and kind of developing the access and rapport. We all, you know, obviously developed the kind of least adult status, but at the time, for example, with the Silicon Valley families, I was a parent, I had kids in school. It made much more sense for me to kind of engage in that world, and then other people to work in sort of different spaces. So, but one of the things is, even when you have access to kids and families, it's very hard to do the kind of classic participant observation. You don't, you know, it's very rare to stay in someone's house. You don't have sleepovers. You don't, you know, you don't do the things that you would do in other kind of contexts. So we developed a series of methodologies: diary studies, media tours of home, social media tours, a range of things, just to try to get access to as many points of points of access and insight into family and domestic life, even when we couldn't actually be there the whole time. And that sort of repeated visits, multi-sided, that's that kind of ethnographic principle of still trying to see things at different times, different seasons, different whatever, we kind of held fast. And I think just, I'll flag this, and I'll talk about this a bit more in the next project, but I think it's just something to say at this point that we were actually conducting this research across two institutions who had very different ethical regimes or ethics regimes. One at UC Berkeley cared deeply about, you know, kind of protection of children and reporting things. USC often carried much more about the kind of legal accountabilities, and that was reflected actually in the ethics documents, in the ways in which we approach things. So we would actually have different, even for the same project, even if someone, you know, was doing it at Berkeley and USC, like we designed, the documents and all of those things actually looked quite different. And so this was really a kind of new terrain at the time. And I think still, as I move institutions again, I'm learning the kind of specificity of ethics in that context. Okay, so the second project, I refrained from, because we are spending a whole kind of period of time today, and then also tomorrow talking about the Transmedia Literacies project. I did not talk about that here, just because I thought we will do so, but I'm happy to do that in discussion. But I wanted to mention this kind of locating the mobile project because it's really been focused on how kind of location technologies are being used by families, and we were looking much more at kind of intergenerational things. So parents, kids, also elderly parents, et cetera. And we've been, it's actually a comparative study, 3 sites. The main work that we've been doing is in Melbourne. So as I've been saying, it's to understand how located media are shaping or sort of shaping and being shaped by practices and experience of intimacy and privacy in intergenerational families. You know, we adapted questions for the 3 kind of local and culturally specific sites. In Melbourne, for example, we focused on gay, lesbian, bi, and transgender families. About 1/3 of our participants are. We focus on families with children, and then also families with transnational migrants. So it's about 1/3 in each of those categories. Compared to the Digital Youth Project and the Transmedia Literacies Project is a very small scale, 12 families in each country. You know, and families of different types and things like that, quite strategically selected, urban families. And what we did was actually stage visits over 2 years. There's a sort of claim in our thing that it's sort of longitudinal. I'm a little bit hesitant because I know different disciplines have quite different kind of ownership of the idea of longitudinal. But the point of this study, because it was households and families, was that we actually staged the visits over 2 years. The first interview just was a kind of general getting to know you, media tours, what's in your house, whatever. It was with one of the local RAs, and then the main kind of investigator, one of the main investigators in Melbourne, which was either Larissa, me, or Sarah. The second, a few months later, we did these, you know, kind of another set of interviews with, which I think Sarah actually took the lead on, which was really looking at the ways in which people were using things and using different technologies and looking much more in depth at routines when they wake up, which is, anyone who knows Sarah Pink's work knows that this is a kind of technique that she used and she kind of brought to this project. The third set of interviews, we looked at people's social media profiles and particularly the practices of data archiving, because that was kind of coming out, trust, data privacy, sharing in the cloud, very granular, fine-grained sort of things. And then, as I mentioned, different researchers and RAs went along. So, as I mentioned, some of the key challenges with this project, ethnographically based, much smaller, much more manageable than other kind of things we did, was that actually we hit a roadblock with ethics within the first draft going in. We wanted to kind of video, as I was mentioning, these kind of families in their households looking at their things. And ethics basically said you can't use anyone's faces, you can't even get permission to use their faces, et cetera. And at one point we developed this kind of technique, which I think we've now published in Mobile Media and Communication, an article on it, kind of researching through the hands and looking at the ways, because for ethical reasons, we couldn't actually kind of record anyone's faces. We did, all of our things have hands. So you'll see that initial things, and on our website, everything has hands. Now you could argue that hands are identifiable, et cetera, but it was a sort of technique to work around the kind of constraints that our ethics at RMIT had. The other sites didn't have these constraints, and so their research looks quite different. I think another kind of challenge for the kind of ethnographic orientation of this project was the kind of change in continuity. There were many researchers on the project, and we tried to keep the kind of local research assistant as the kind of person who was the continuous thing, and then different people would kind of come in to kind of bring new insight. And so that was one way that we had a longer term project, but very short term things. So I would come in and talk about the data stuff and things like that, and we would try to do things so we wouldn't repeat. We would listen to the previous interviews, et cetera, or read them, but move along there. And then I think the third challenge, because of these things like the ethical regimes I've been talking about and the kind of norms and the kind of different families, the cross-national comparison becomes quite challenging. It's not, we're not comparing like for like. We're looking at families. We're looking at different families. We're looking at families selected for particular reasons. So the kind of claims we can make about the cross-national comparison always have to be kind of couched in those terms. So final slide. I think for me, so picking up on that question of kind of the long and short-term studies, I think the question for me is kind of, what do you want to learn and know? How can you learn and know it? How might, what might you be missing, especially if you are kind of taking a kind of more ethnographic approach? So you're not trying to replicate traditional ethnographic studies, but you're trying to kind of keep those principles of empathetic understandings of people from their things. So I think one of the challenges that we've found, and I think even on the Transmedia Literacies project, as Carlos well knows, is the kind of institutional context place quite a few constraints on the kind of access to or time with young people and families. Schools, you go into a school, they say, you have to, you can only work with kids for this long, you have to leave then, we don't let you do this, boards of education, shorten your interview time, et cetera. So as you kind of navigate these, the kind of ideal research design sort of changes. Ethical considerations in national context, I talked a little bit about the difference between Berkeley and USC, RMIT and some of the colleagues I've been talking to in Spain, the things I was like, oh, if we had that much time with kids, or that much time, it would be amazing. So those kind of national contexts make these kind of broad scale studies, they provide kind of challenges. But I think there's also a lot of new possibilities that we've been all experimenting with to really kind of create, in some ways, what you might think of as proxies for the kind of time and access to kids and families that you might have. So the multiple visits and the multiple kind of techniques of kind of going in, the movement across sites and contexts and finding creative ways to kind of do that, use of digital media and technologies as forms of documentation and archives, and kind of understanding what you have, whether what you have is a snapshot or something that is sort of, that actually captures change over time and continuity. So I think I will leave it there for discussion.
Thank you very much for both presentations. Well, it's question time. I don't know if you already have any questions, or I can start with a couple of things. I have many questions here, but okay.
How do the bits of paper reach you?
They were right.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
It's analogical, huh?
Yes.
I have many things. I took notes. I'm going to start. Okay. I was checking the book yesterday, and for Sonia, when you start the research, you said the first day you asked these teenagers about mobile phones and social media, and they say Facebook. And we are talking about long-term research, and we confirm that in our research that the reality is changing very fast. In our research, when we start, teenagers were using Snapchat, and after a few months, they were not using Snapchat anymore, most of them. So how do you deal with these fast migrations in social media when you're processing all this information and getting information from the field? Also, for here the question, but Sonia, I imagine the question when I was reading this situation.
It's a tough question. I mean, it's partly why I think we maybe love this field, because it is always changing and throwing up new challenges, and so there are always more questions to ask and more research needed. But I think, I guess we haven't discussed how we define media literacy, and maybe we don't want to go there. But one conception clearly is the relationship between what the young people know, the cultural understanding of particular media forms and devices, and the particular affordances of those devices. And so I think what we have to do methodologically, kind of following on Heather's point, is that we can't just take the words Snapchat, Facebook, Tumblr, whatever. We have to ask the young people, as it were, how they understand those different platforms, what affordances they engage with. We, of course, have our own views about what affordances they don't engage with, or what kind of missed opportunities there might be, but perhaps we don't have a very elaborated and stable language yet for thinking about how to describe that digital environment that they are engaging with. But somehow that's what we have to, and then those features, of course, change less rapidly. So questions of anonymity, of privacy management, of the nature of the networks, these things we can. But yeah, Facebook today, Snapchat tomorrow, whatever.
Maybe tomorrow Facebook will disappear.
Yes. This is not a good week for Facebook.
No.
Or maybe it's a good week for Facebook. Good week for the public.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I think this is why I kind of maintain, they don't always have to do ethnography, but I think I maintain that kind of commitment because, what we tend to find is, with these projects, creative workarounds, but you also find, we didn't intend to look at people's kind of data archiving sort of things. It was something that emerged in the second phase of the interviews. And so we actually went through and then designed a kind of particular kind of probe to kind of deal with that. So I think, that kind of iterative process is quite important to be able to kind of maintain and design into it. I mean, you can still, it's difficult because you have ethics and, you have the last thing we want to do is go back and amend things and things like that. I mean, this is obviously a huge problem in Australia, but it may not be as all-consuming elsewhere. But I think that's sort of one. And I think there's, one of the things that's interesting about the kind of Australia work we've been doing on the project talked about, but also this one is that we're really finding that the worlds that are created are very almost kind of egocentric, and that everyone's worlds are sort of different, and it's becoming quite their kind of media worlds are different. It's becoming quite difficult to say all kids do this, all kids do that, if you know about this, if you know about that. And so it actually challenges, I think you have to sort of assume diversity rather than singularity. So it's not really, those aren't really answers, but it's sort of more how we grapple with it.
Okay, thank you. Remember that we have our colleagues here with the papers if you want to ask questions. We have the first question here. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and you will receive the paper. Okay, for Sonia, digital media use appears ephemeral with little long-term impact. Is it the nature of the technology? Is it insignificant?
It's insignificant.
Insignificant.
Well, digital media, I believe, are far from ephemeral. They're here to stay, but they're changing all the time, as we just said. The interesting discussion now, perhaps, is whether even our focus on anything that is related to the screen, or indeed writing of some kind, maybe this is also changing as digital technologies become embedded in our everyday objects. So I don't think it's ephemeral, and I didn't want to say it was insignificant, but you cannot say there is the importance of digital media in a kind of a fixed part of young people's lives, and then other things are unrelated. I was trying to really say there are moments when digital media engagement is focal, and the kind of the key focus of someone's experimentation and their identity play and identity work, or their relationship work, and then at other times they shift their attention. And my hypothesis about that shift is partly that there's only so much autonomous attention young people can sustain when both their parents and their school are very strongly and powerfully telling them that this is unimportant and there are other things they must engage with, and scaffolding the learning of those other things. So young people are bombarded with adults telling them what their priorities should be. And so, but you know, for me the most powerful thing is this is still, digital media is still something that they are intrinsically and spontaneously motivated by, and we haven't yet found the way of making that as significant as it could be.
Thanks.
I think.
Well, okay.
Yep.
Okay, well, we see a lot of questions.
I like this technique. I'm going to use it in teaching.
Well, these are general questions
I think.
because we have one specific header. How do you reach the families, and how do they receive the idea of participating in the project?
It depends on the project. But so for the Digital Youth Project, it was the way that I sort of gained access to families was actually through a parent that I knew sent out the kind of recruitment script over email through a school, and it went through a network of schools in the San Francisco Bay Area, which basically meant that I interviewed kids all the way up in San Francisco and all the way down to kind of San Jose or south of there, which is, I don't know, like 60 miles or something like that. So it actually had a pretty wide distribution network. Others recruited through peers, and then the kids brought the things home. Others recruited through families, et cetera. For the locating the mobile study, because we were quite specific about the families, the kinds of families that we wanted to kind of look at because of kind of broader changes in Australian society, we went through quite intensive snowball sort of network. So I think our research assistants actually were quite familiar with a number of the families and actually had a more kind of long-term, kind of engagement with them beyond the kind of life of the project. Not all of them, and then, other kind of things. But so it's always been quite kind of particular to the research and all of that stuff. But then it's not actually easy either. I mean, it takes a lot of creativity and a really good research assistant often. So, yeah.
Sonia?
Well, I would just echo Heather's key point, which is that we might sit and design, as it were, our perfect kind of sampling strategy, but in fact what we do is we often pull on initial contacts, and you become quite creative in thinking, who is it that you know, and then leading from there to further contacts. I think partly because the very concept of research is quite unfamiliar to people, and the idea of people coming from the university to look at their lives is quite weird. So you kind of need a personal relationship, and then you spend probably most of your effort trying to diversify who you reach, so it isn't just middle-class educated people like you, but you're always kind of pushing at the edges of your network. And I've just been advising one of my PhD students who did design his perfect sampling strategy, got so many sorry, no, too busy, can't do it, and has had to rethink that a little realism is required. Yeah.
In our research, we have some specific situations in Latin American countries, because in Europe, for parents, it's normal to receive every week something you have to sign from a school. But in Latin America, that's not so popular. So when you ask parents to sign an informed consent, say, what's that? What are you going to do with my children?
Yeah.
Well, we have to respect European protocols, so it was not easy in the beginning.
And in the EU Kids Online project, we had very different response from different parts of Europe, and I guess in some of the Eastern European countries, it was fantastically hard to knock on the door and say, hello, I'm from the university. People often didn't even open the door. So then you need some other strategies.
Yep.
From the back door.
No. Well, schools can be a great way of, that's where it's good for recruiting kids.
Why didn't the dog bark?
Dogs are a problem in fieldwork, I have to say.
Okay, we have an interesting question. It's about how can researchers integrate ethnographic approach with big data and large quantitative data sets? Are these methods compatible?
I spent quite a lot of time thinking about the relation between ethnographic and other qualitative studies and survey research. I am yet to be convinced, so somebody here can persuade me, that big data is going to tell me anything so brilliant, because in big data, as far as I can see at the moment, you don't know even who is a child or an adult. You know where they are, you don't know who they are, you don't know anything about their context very often. So unless it's quite targeted big data, quite middle-sized data, but when you see these huge things of who is treating in Europe, I don't know what that's got to do with families. So I'm yet to be convinced. But I do try very consciously to oscillate between what I learn in small-scale qualitative feedback, fieldwork, and what I see from national survey studies. And not to say one is right and the other is wrong, but I want there to be a dialogue where I understand how they interrelate.
I think, we have been kind of playing around with what data ethnographies, for example, could look like, or and what that actually means, and all of that. I think it's quite difficult. Most of the people who I know who've engaged with this, have a similar kind of reaction, that it's not, it sort of tells me either what I already know or is so decontextualized that it's not useful. And so I haven't really hit at the right study of the kind of things that I would do, that it would be sort of meaningful. I know there are, some people who are doing like smart, like tracking of self-tracking technologies and things like that, and looking at those sort of things, and that, it seems to be closer to that. But we, for the most part, it feels like ethnography continues to just play a kind of critical role about, kind of interrogating what do you mean by data, whose data, what's missing, that sort of thing. And certainly in parts of the world that I work, they just don't even map. So that, I think, is, for the moment, for me, the role of ethnography in big data. But there are a lot of people who are trying to kind of think about if there are other relationships.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a classic question, but I think it's connected to your research in the sense, especially for Heather, in the sense, what do you think about the categories digital natives and digital immigrants? Do they explain the relationship between youth and technologies? But you have been working in Silicon Valley families. Do they have digital natives there, or?
Well, I don't like the terms, and I don't use them. So we'll just put that out on the table, and I haven't for quite some time. I think that was one of the kind of questions with the Silicon Valley research, is whether or not, how was the kind of fact, not just the technologies, but actually the fact that the parents were working at Apple and Google and those sort of things that those kind of companies become part of the kind of fabric of the family, and technologies become part of the kind of rituals and things like that. Those are kind of quite interesting. But yeah, I would never kind of, I mean, I think it's as a rhetorical device when talking to people about the kind of things, the sense that their kids are doing things that they don't understand or they can't kind of keep up. It's not there, but I don't think the evidence kind of bears itself out. And I think, we're also doing a lot of things with, as we look at like intergenerational families, and sometimes, it's you can't assume that it's actually the youngest person or the person of the right age who is the savviest. A lot of times it's like some of the most interesting interviews we've done are with people who are retired, who have gone into online knitting groups and created, cooking things and are all over Snapchat and all over things and communicating with family and, Malaysia and Thailand and whatever, and doing things and using platforms and technologies that in Australia aren't as common. So I think the evidence is very much kind of against that, although I understand why it sort of took off and why people started to use it. So.
You, Sonia, in your Global Kids project, have you found any digital natives anywhere?
In the world?
I think the value of the terms, which is extremely limited, is that they are so widespread that they become a point of critical engagement between the research and the assumptions, especially partly of the public, but especially of policymakers. So I think I only really use them with scare quotes to argue both young people are not such digital natives that they don't need any educational support or help because they struggle in various ways. And second, parents are not such digital immigrants that they are complete know-nothings and should just be given incredibly simple advice, which they are. So arguing parents are, as it were, more knowledgeable now than they were just a few years ago. We should be appealing to that knowledge and working with them and critiquing the assumption about young people so they do get good media literacy education or could get it. This is the value of, as it were, popular terms.
Okay, thank you.
But people know it even when they say it to you now. I think they kind of say it with scare quotes too.
Okay. We have different questions. To Heather, this is a good one. How do you get financial support for this kind of research? Tell us.
Well, so I was just a postdoc on the Digital Youth Project. So it was Mimi and Peter Lyman and Michael Carter who got one of the first grants from the Macarthur Foundation, the Digital Media Learning Initiative, and that I think that initiative is sort of it's closed its doors, but that's
Money
how
spent.
Yeah, the money's gone. But Sonia eventually came on with that kind of big investment. But that was a kind of particular moment in time, and also with people who had long-term relationships with the Macarthur Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. The Locating the Mobile is a open-ended competitive grant with the Australian Research Council, and the one that we had in particular is a linkage, which in Australia means that it has an industry partner. So Intel and Genevieve Bell is our kind of industry partner. So they put in a certain amount of money each year, and it's a certain percentage of the grant that you sort of get. The Australian Research Council often, I don't know why I'm going on and on about this, but they often, you apply for a certain amount of money and they often fund you for less. And that was the case with this grant. So we had to reconfigure our budgets and reconfigure our design and reconfigure those sorts of things. But yeah, so yeah. Or you find Carlos, who finds Horizon 2020.
No, but I think Sonia. No, because we have many friends and colleagues in the UK, and now the perspectives are complicated for the UK, thinking especially from European financial support. I don't know.
Complicated from any perspective.
No.
Well, yes, absolutely. I guess I have some faith that this is an area people are interested in, so there will be kind of funding somewhere, and there is quite a lot of projects happening. As Heather said, we never get as much money or the kind of money or when the money is exactly is wanted, but I don't know. I feel a bit worried about the future of European funding from a British point of view. Our government says they'll continue supporting. Who knows? I have a bit of Australian Research Council money right now via our colleague Lelia Green, which has allowed us, interestingly, to photograph toddlers playing with their tablet. The project is called Toddlers and Tablets, and we have tons of video of faces. Yeah. So different universities, different things allowed. I think we just have to be a little bit opportunistic. My next project is being funded by one of our regulators, and the regulators also often want to be evidence-based, so it's never big money, but it's something.
What I can say from my experience is it's easier to get money for transmedia literacy than for transmedia storytelling, for example. Because Europe, they don't think interested in storytelling. No. Well, we have a long question here. This is for Sonia. To Sonia, how to sustain creative engagement? What can be done on policy level? How do you see schools supporting and sustaining children's creative engagement with digital media?
Yeah, well, that's the question. Absolutely. Well, there are many people in this room who have worried about this question a lot. I suppose what our study kind of allowed us to see is some of the ways in which things went wrong. What were all the barriers? And sometimes they were just as small as really attending to children. A child might say in quite a tentative way to a parent or a teacher, I've tried this out, and the parent or teacher will say, not now, or I'm busy, or, show me next. And the moment, there's such kind of gentle moments sometimes when a child just wants to show you, and then they ask the question, how do I do the next thing? And there's a lot of kind of adults just a bit too clumsy and a bit too busy to do, and children turn away so fast. That's something that we saw a lot. Then I think the kind of the monolithic, and not to say all schools are entirely instrumental and they have no creative teachers. Of course they have creative teachers doing their best. But the ethos of the school is crucial, and the schools in Britain are so now driven by a government agenda of rankings and metricization and instrumentalization of everything that it's very hard, even for those teachers who want to create a more creative space within the classroom to do so. And when they can, the struggle is then about assessment. And we don't talk a lot about how digital creative learning gets assessed and how it gets valued. This is something that the Macarthur Foundation really did try to engage with very seriously, with the notion of badging for recognizing out-of-school activities. There needs to be perhaps more to rethink different forms of assessment within school, because as long as children's creative activities don't count, that is just such a kind of profound disincentive for adults to support and engage.
Okay. You want to say something? Okay. We have another long question here. I'm interested in adult media literacy as a form of diminishing the fears about teenagers' use of social media. Would you consider to approach cybersecurity and for web safety with adult literacy as a starting point? What are your experiences about contacting adults and maybe analyzing their possible limitations?
Not sure if I get the question.
I have more questions.
My current project is with parents, and so this is the kind of the end of the Macarthur Foundation money, and I've been doing field work with around 70 parents in the London area, and there are lots of anxieties. very often, I think, they let us in the door in the first place because they wanted to talk about their worries and anxieties about their children's safety with digital media and all their worries about how much screen time and are they young enough for this or should they be doing whatever. So there's a kind of hunger from parents' point of view, which I think is not being met except by a very panicky popular press, which says ban it, ban it, ban it, or, you know, all the reasons to worry. It's quite a struggle to see how structurally we work to support adult media literacy. They're not in school. The mass media are perhaps the only institutional organisation that can really reach them. I don't know why well, I do know why, but I could wish the mass media themselves did more to educate adults. The organisation that very often does reach parents is various kinds of health providers, and they are number one advocates of the problems of screen time. So they don't engage at all with how and why and with what kind of consequence children use media. So I think there's kind of lots of structural problems in reaching parents, but I think they would like generally to be reached. So we should be attending to some of those structural possibilities.
Okay, I think we have time for 5 minutes, then we have the coffee break. Yesterday, during the first dialogue between Divina and David, part of the conversation was about moral panic and media panic. And one of the things we discussed in this conversation was about, are we reproducing old medial panics in the sense many years ago we had the risk of cinema on children, and then in the 50s comics were the evil, and then we had the effects of television on children. Are we reproducing some kind of media panic in this new 21st century? I'm thinking especially in social media or video games.
I don't think, I think David's points yesterday were quite useful in, his discussion of, remembering, yes, there are moral panics often accompany new technologies, but the differences are quite distinct and real, and we need to sort of appreciate them. I'm at the moment I'm doing a project I didn't talk about in Fiji, and there you can really see, it's a place where over half the population's on Facebook, has an emerging kind of middle class, it has all of those things, and a lot of the panics about kind of social media use, and they're doing all the same bullying, the cyberbullying, they've had kids commit suicide, they've had, all of the things that we are sort of experiencing, are happening there, probably at smaller scale, but nevertheless happening. And in that context, a lot of the kind of panics that are happening are about digital media, but they're also about changing middle class norms and changing structures of the family and changing all of those sort of things. So we're doing a film, for example, right now on smartphones, social media, and parenting. And it's incredibly easy to talk to parents about it. It's the easiest film, I think the problem will be cutting. But also, it's going to be impossible to kind of extricate the kind of worries about smartphone, those sort of things from all of these other kind of changes that are happening in society and the family and all of that sort of stuff. So I think, in addition to David's comment about, appreciating the kind of specificity and historicity of these particular moments, I think also the kind of particular context and things are important. So I think we don't want to kind of turn our back on what the kind of moral panics mean. Because they do get, we kind of go, oh God, here we are again. But I think we do have to kind of take them seriously, and they do kind of change, the kind of things that people are worried about are changing, even in the course of like the 10 years since the Digital Youth Project, for example. So.
Thank you. Sonia? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was trying to work out who we is in your question. Do you mean we society or we researchers? So I hope that we researchers don't reproduce the moral panics, but of course some researchers do, because it does generate funding and it is kind of in our interest to do so, curiously, to get attention. But Assuming you meant do we society, yes, because society is always worried about and needs to throw a spotlight on what is changing, what is technologically new, and we're always worried about, or maybe not always worried, but for a long time we get worried about children and what that means. The other part of the moral panic is where we try to make the critique, which is that it tends to bring with it a kind of determinism that says the technology is the only change that is relevant, and it brings with it the kind of moral judgment that says we know what we're doing with the technology, but the great unwashed masses are irresponsible and stupid. I mean, so some parts are understandable, I think, as Heather just said. Other parts have to be roundly critiqued and always have had. I think just the one thing that feels to me new, and I know every generation thinks it's facing the new, but comics, cinema, television, computer games, one could always say, okay, so turn it off, restrict it. It's just leisure time. I know there were hopes for them, but basically it was kind of more in the... Now we're talking about the technology that underpins our work, that underpins our education, that underpins our commercial life, there is... So a different kind of a conversation has to be had about how we identify the risks and opportunities.
Thank you. Just to conclude, one tip for researchers of media literacy, teenagers, just a tweet.
140 characters, Sonia. You can do it.
I think media literacy matters more than ever, and it's fantastic to see a room of people who are engaging with the ideas and taking them forward critically, because it's vital.
How to get the money?
No, I mean, Australia.
I think, the thing is, I think I don't identify as a media literacies researcher per se, and so I have a hard time sort of doing it. But I do agree that we need to kind of think about it, and I do think that this work. I think media literacies, and I'm at the moment really quite consumed with data literacies, and so I'll just leave it.
Okay, thank you very much for your participation, your questions. We talk about many things. We talk about the Brexit. We didn't talk about Catalonia, so perfect. You didn't explain us how to get the sabbatical, but we are going to talk about that on the coffee break. Okay, we have the coffee break, thanks, and we have the round table about the Transmedia Literacy Project presentation. So thanks, and thank you, Sonia and Heather.